afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here, enjoying this wonderful church. I'm very grateful to Poliphonia and to Emmanuel Church for allowing this concert to happen here. I started with Joaquin Turina, one of the major composers of Spanish modernism, a piece that was composed 100 years ago, so now it's early music too, in spite of being labeled modernist, and probably a composer that met the main composer of this evening, that is Francisco Mignone. Many people who are interested in music for the guitar or music of the 20th century will know the name of Heitor Villa-Lobos, which is the major Brazilian composer of last century. But many people have not ever heard the name of Francisco Mignone, who was of the same generation, and a composer just as interesting and as valuable to our literature. Maybe because he had a career that was much more circumscribed to his own country, at least for a while, and a complete musician who was a very fine pianist. There are some videos on YouTube of Mignone playing the piano. He was also a conductor. I had the privilege of seeing him conduct 2 years before he died, and a very fine teacher as well, and a composer that had a perfect technique, especially in his major orchestral works. And he took interest for the guitar there is a date for it, July 1970. There was a big guitar festival in Porto Alegre, in the south of Brazil at that time, and there he met the great virtuoso Carlos Barbosa Lima, who died in March this year. While he really was very impressed with Carlos' virtuosity, and went on to compose 12 etudes, 12 waltzes in all minor keys in the form of etudes as well, and a few years later he wrote a guitar concerto. So Mignone was already in his 80s when he wrote the guitar concerto, so we owe to Barbosa Lima this magnificent literature that has so much enlarged the high-quality music literature for the guitar coming from Latin America at that time. They are modernist pieces in the sense of the modernism of the 1920s. We cannot really talk of Mignone as a kind of developmental composer. He pretty much stuck to his aesthetics most of his career, with a very brief hiatus in the 1960s when he wrote atonal music mainly. But this is a kind of resurrection of his attachments to the Brazilian culture, to the Brazilian things, to the Brazilian images. At the same time, these pieces, they have a web of influences and quotations that are very, very much integrated in the texture in a way that we simply cannot identify. It just sounds like very fluent and accomplished guitar music. So I'm going to play in two blocks. In between them, I'm going to play a Suite Castellana by Moreno Torroba, another Spanish composer from the 1920s, which is the last movement, the danza, is probably one of the first pieces to be written for the guitar by a non-guitarist composer. Torroba went on to have a splendid career as a zarzuela composer, but he wrote a lot for the guitar under the inspiration of the great virtuoso of that time, André Segovia. I don't have any records of Segovia ever meeting Francisco Mignone, but it's not difficult to imagine that he would have taken fancy in those pieces had he had access to them. Barbosa Lima recorded the 12 etudes in the 1970s. We can only have that in vinyl. But now we have a few recordings coming out, and it seems that finally Mignone is having a great time as a guitar composer, and I very much hope that will be inspiration for you. I feel very privileged for having recorded this amazing work. So the first 6 etudes by Francisco Mignone first.